Hello, everyone. Can I get a ooh, ooh? What the no? I'm trying. I'm being hopeful, okay? And I thought this one was actually good, except for the no. Okay, so can I get a ooh, ooh? Oh my God, you're getting better! I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of you. Thank you so much. Okay, guys, we have 4 speakers coming up. Legendary people, all of them. Starting off, we have Rami Ismail, who's an industry ambassador, an independent games developer with over 157 game credits and counting. And if you stay tuned after this talk, he's going to have another talk right after about picking the right game. So remember to just stay in your seats when they're done. And then we have Sigurlina Ingvarsdottir, who's a founding partner of Behold Venture, which is a venture capital fund investing in early-stage game industry companies across the Nordics and Europe. Then we also have Maslowicz, who's a VP of partnerships and investments at Tencent Games and has worked at both Xbox and Sega before. And then, last but not least, we have Della Rocca, who's a game business consultant, investor, funding advisor, and ecosystem strategist, which basically means that he spends his time advising game studio founders on funding and product strategy, and advising governments around the world how to better support their regional game development ecosystem. So they all have a lot to say. This is a very interesting talk. So please welcome out all of them. Rami Ismail, Sigurlina Ingvarsdottir, Mark Maslowicz, and Della Rocca. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Grab a seat. I just wanted to point out Rami has 157 credits, not 56, 150, exactly. How do you even keep track? All right, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. This is the final panel of the day before Rami gets the stage solo. We were asked to do this kind of discussion, reflection on the quote-unquote crisis that's going on in the industry. What does that mean? What is it actually? And also trying to kind of add a positive twist to things in terms of what does that mean? How do we adapt? What are new strategies? What's the new path to success? And so we're going to sort of dig into this topic for the next 45 minutes or so. With that out of the way, I guess my friend, and you got all the intro, so we're going to skip the normal kind of bio stuff, but. I'm going to ask the panelists kind of their thought of, or when did they think like, oh crap, shit's going down, like we're in trouble, like there's some red flags, like oh, this is going to be a rough quarter, rough year. Ram, does anything come to mind, a specific moment where like, oh shit?
I think for me, the first moment where I started worrying a little bit was when a lot of the boutique publishers had pushed up the budget for indie games pretty high compared to a while ago. So that's probably like 5-6 years ago, but there was money, right? There was enough money kind of going in so that train kept going. Then obviously when the money stopped, that became a massive problem because the scope of indie games had grown very aggressively at that point.
Okay, but interesting is it's when they increased the amount of money, that was the concern.
Yeah, when that number got to the point where I just saw indie studios growing just to be able to ask the right amount of money, that's when I started getting I was starting to sweat a little. I was like,
that was even like pre-COVID, I think.
That's pre-COVID, yeah. That was where I was like, this is probably not super sustainable.
So wise beyond your years, Rami.
I'm just scared.
Lena, any kind of signal that made you kind of go, oh shit?
Well, I think, we started preparing Behold Ventures in 2021 and started fundraising in 2022. And in the kind of the wake of COVID, money was plentiful and things were quite easy. And then I think in the beginning of 2023, the kind of atmosphere started to shift significantly. And I think for me, just understanding that, both it was going to be a lot harder for our teams to fundraise, but also for ourselves. And that felt like a relatively quick shift.
Interesting. And Mark, I mean, given you're at one of the biggest game company on the planet, kind of where was that like? Oh,
well, I mean, I was at Microsoft at the time where, this is probably 1920, where the level of investment in the industry was going up and up. And Tencent were at the forefront, but obviously Embracer, Microsoft were doing a lot of stuff. There was a lot of activity happening. So the money seemed to be flowing. And it kind of led to this peak in sort of late 21, early 22. I can't remember the exact dates, but, when Take-Two bought Zynga, when Microsoft bought ABK, then Sony bought Bungie. And then, it seemed obvious to me at some point this couldn't go on. There was going to have to be a correction. But, unfortunately, the trigger point was sad to bring real-world events into it. The war in Ukraine kicked off in early 22, and people took a pause when that first happened. But a lot of companies were trying to figure out, a lot of companies who invest might have had various investments in Russia or Ukraine, and how do you figure out these complicated situations, which you don't expect to have to deal with in the gaming industry. But, when that all happened, I think that put a pause, and then it really sort of almost fell off a cliff after that. And for me, at least, it's kind of weird timing. I'd literally joined Tencent in January 22, ready to jump on the bus and do investments. And then within a month, everything stopped. I do have some hope for optimism. I do certainly think it's picking up now, but I guess we'll get to that later.
Yeah, at that moment. Yeah, I mean, interesting that you mentioned Ukraine. We were literally closing a huge M&A deal. And we were waiting for the documents, and the buyer was publicly traded, and at that moment it's like everything shut down, and the deal fell apart, and it just never came back. So yeah, that was also kind of a key moment. So obviously, as Rami likes to say, I'm very old. And I've been around the industry for almost 30 years, and I've seen patterns. Right, you start to notice the up and down cycles. Going as far back as the ET landfills. Although I wasn't around, I wasn't in the industry at that point. But some of the earlier crises before, the late 90s. The global financial crisis in 2007, 8, 9, and sort of the kind of almost creative destruction that happens. Things fall apart, but then the phoenixes rise, and all this kind of stuff. I mean, you've been in the industry long. I mean, you were around during the global financial crisis, I guess. Yeah. I mean, Mark's got gray hair too. So.
I predate you. I probably, in the industry.
Oh, okay.
That's how old I am. But
okay, but I mean, so maybe as the elder.
No, I mean, the one thing I'll say is, when I started at Sega, this was in the 90s. I mean, a dev budget for a AAA game back then was, maybe don't quote me on exact numbers, but maybe $1 million. Yeah. And then as every generation progressively went along, we went from $1 million to 5 million, to 10 million, to 50. And now, I mean, certainly if you're a US developer, you're not making AAA for under 200 million. Yeah. And the budgets have gone up and up. Yep. The market, I'd say in that period, the console market has been relatively flat. Steam has done incredible in terms of growing the industry on PC, but it's not gone up exponentially in the way cost did. Yeah. Game prices have stayed the same, or in real terms have dropped. So the numbers at some point just don't add up anymore.
Right. I think we saw very similar in indie games. When I started in independent game development, that was 2010, so that's quite a bit later. But when indie started, sort of the thing I always remember is that there was another thing before that. There was these B games, right? Sort of like you had your bigger games, and then you had sort of clones of that. If you had Whiplash on the PlayStation, you had Killer Loop, which was like Whiplash but not Whiplash. You would have Destruction Derby. And they would have like Fatal Racing. And it was just the same game, just made cheap, right? And when indie came out, that entire market segment just died. Because suddenly for the same price as a clone of a game, you could get something completely new, something unique, something bite-sized, something weird. And so the rise of indie kind of came with the destruction of this other market segment, right? And I always try to kind of keep that in mind when I look at these kind of situations. Because for indie, when I started an indie budget was $30,000, right? Like noodles and $30,000, and a McDonald's voucher. And then as that went on and publishers kind of got involved and then funding got involved, now an indie budget very reasonably sits at, like small indie games sits at $150,000, $300,000.
We could ask you to define indie. I'd love to get your definition.
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah, no, that would
That's
be
the
great.
next talk.
Great. Yeah, but like a small indie game now is 150 to 300K for many budget sizes, and you're looking at mid-sized indie games at $500,000 plus.
Yeah.
That's an old AAA budget. That like to me that is staggering, right?
Yeah. Lina, what year did you start in the industry?
In 2006.
Okay, so like right before the big crash.
Yeah.
So what,
we
like-
were actually, I think, CCP was at that time looking for some significant funding. We had some people from Lehman Brothers supposed to come visit us late September, and that didn't happen. There was a lot of preparation that was for nothing when that bank fell apart, and I mean the country fell apart as well. So it was it's very fresh in my memory.
Yeah, well, so you start, I mean, you endure some of these and you adapt and adopt and you figure out new strategies. So, I mean, I think my point there, not to necessarily rehash past crises, but, these kinds of ups and downs do occur. And certainly for those that are newer to the industry, don't necessarily know that, we've had those ups and downs as an industry. And I think for the most part, have always come out stronger for it. That being said, last year there was definitely the tagline like survive to 25, right? And now they're saying the tagline is just survive, and when are we going to go back to normal and all that kind of stuff. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is like this is the normal. And potentially the argument could be made that, going back a decade, when interest rates were kind of, at I don't know, 5, 6, 7%, when capital wasn't free and free flowing and so on, that was the normal state. And only this kind of like, call it past decade, is in fact the anomaly that we have sort of been living through. And so it's not that like we're down, it's just that we were up more before, and so it's kind of
and with an extreme bump through COVID.
Yeah, but then and through COVID was like an extra little turbo boost. But I mean, is that sort of your sense that like this is the normal, and what happened before, in fact, was the anomaly, as opposed to this being the anomaly?
That's how I see it for sure. Like I think, especially COVID was sort of an odd time, but that kind of 2020 to 2023 was definitely sort of a very strange time. Very high optimism. Very high optimism on the market, in games. Very high optimism in the independent game space as well. I think that has definitely sort of like come back down, but I don't think it came back down to where it can't sustain itself. It just can't sustain what it was doing. Right? And what it was doing was definitely like, you were hearing about, because I do consultancy, I do scouting, I work as an agent, helping indie games get connected to publishers and funding. And you would get deals signed on like 4 resumes, right? It was just like 4 people, they worked at UB, Activision, whatever. People would see that and go, yep. And you'd be like, no, these 4, even though they're incredible at their job, they've never ran a project. They've never ran a studio. They have no idea how to do business. And you're going to give them millions of dollars to burn it, right? And so to me, that's an anomaly. It felt like reckless. It felt like a reckless sort of like period.
And I think to add to that, I think specifically, we are investing specifically in the Nordics and Europe, and I think the US saw an incredible influx of capital and incredible valuations of founders with great resumes and coming out of companies in large companies in Southern California, and these valuations really. Initial valuations didn't really make sense for any subsequent rounds or any revenue that these games needed to make. Yep. And I think that skewed the market quite a lot. And there's a lot of hiccup from that. I don't think it happened to the same extent on this side of the pond.
Yeah.
I'll just say, I think, the industry is going through change, but change isn't necessarily bad. If you had horse-drawn carriages back in the day and then cars came along, I don't know, maybe that's not progress. I don't know, you can have debates on that. But, in the 80s when I was a kid playing games, consoles came in, and for maybe 20 years, the model was the same. You'd make a console game, it would be on cartridge, later it would be on a disc. You'd pay the platform holder the royalty. This is pre-indie because, the platform holders had control and there was no way. Steam wasn't a thing back then, so there was no real way for an indie to get their game to market. So the big companies effectively controlled the market. And, that went on for 20 years. And then, when you finished a game, if it was success, you started on the sequel. There was no DLC back then or anything like that. Then as the world went digital, that was the beginning of the shift, because then, first it was DLCs, and then, eventually that's led to live services and free to play at the, extreme end. And that's, where the market's gone. And, I remember, there were times, at Xbox I'd often look at the top 10 games every year. And, pretty much every year, in Europe at least, there'd be FIFA. In America, there'd be Madden. Call of Duty would be there every year. But 8 of the others would be different new ones every year. Now, the 8 or 9 of the top 10 are the same every year. So if you launch a game now, I'm talking more the bigger budget guys, that's why it's more difficult. You got to compete with Fortnite, Apex, Roblox, etc. And they're not going to give up easy. These guys are making a lot of money. They're plowing it back into their businesses and trying to entrench their positions. And so it's very, very difficult to launch a new live service game. I think there've been obviously some spectacular failures in the last year. But it does mean that the AAA or the sort of top end of the industry is just consolidating and very, very difficult. At least the bright hope for me is, Rami's, around that 2010s when Steam came in, then Sony did their player, and then ID at Xbox came along. And now if you're an independent developer, you can release a game without a publisher. And that's great for the industry.
Well, but I also, I would like to add to that. I think that, back when I started in 2006, CCP, where I started in the games industry, had actually kind of pioneered an online publishing model out of necessity, because they had signed a publishing deal with Simon & Schuster, and they had closed their division. So the game was out, but no boxes were being sold because the publisher had shut down. So online publishing and live service for them became, was just born out of necessity. But at that time, video games were a hobby for nerds. It was a fairly small segment of the population that played video games. Now we are, now it's the biggest entertainment industry in the world. Half of the world's population plays games, so it's completely different. And I think that's also kind of the bright side of the industry, is that people are not stopping. More and more people are playing games, and we're absolutely not doing that. But our distribution models and our channels are they're clogged. Discoverability is everyone's kind of biggest concern right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to get into that. But Mark, just to echo some of your comments, I think some of the recent Steam data shows that I think it's something like 48 or 49% of the revenue from last year is from indie games, which is the first time in the history of Steam that it's almost at parity with sort of, call it AAA productions. So I think that sort of speaks to a major shift that's occurring in some of the challenges that AAA has had. And also the top 20 new releases on Steam, half of them are indie, meaning not AA, not AAA. Of course, there's those kind of black hole games like the Fortnites and Robloxes.
You've got to be brave to sign off a $200 million budget game today in the current market. You'd have to be a brave exec to sign that off, I think.
Well, you can do it, Mark. You can do it.
We believe in you. Yeah.
Give it a shot. All right. Well, so Lina, obviously, as someone who's actively investing in early stage game studios, I'm sure a big part of what you and your team does is to help those teams kind of navigate, either the ones that you have already invested in, or the ones that you're looking to invest in and are now going to kind of take them on board, how to navigate these turbulent times and so on. What are some of the things that you advise them? What are the maybe obvious mistakes they might be doing that now you've seen some of the patterns and you're saying, hey, watch out for this, watch out for that. Mm-hmm. Give us a sort of a mini advisement here on how to navigate.
Well, I think, because we started investing at the tail end of the money was plentiful, we see a difference in our portfolio companies versus the ones that actually managed to raise their first rounds when money was plentiful versus the ones that are raising in this current climate. And I think we look for, resilience is non-negotiable in a founder in today's economy. So we advise them to be obviously very frugal, if they have an opportunity to bring in revenue through any means, that's something that we see as a positive. We definitely don't want our studios to be kind of providing contracted services and not focusing on the games that they're building. But if they have a previous game, or they have a project, or they have a tool or something that they can sell, and some of them actually are, have been able to do that, have been able to add a few months maybe to the runway through something like that. But also just to think very hard about hiring people or bringing them on. And I think that, the teams that are racing and making games today, they're a lot more scrappy than some of the more bloated teams from previous years, which I think is good. But I think, we would look at 12 to 18 months as a runway, kind of as a rule of thumb, 18 months. Now we're like, okay, at least 24 months, because you just don't want to be spending your entire time fundraising, as an example.
Yeah, it feels like the time they have to rush so much to get to some traction, and they have to enter fundraise mode almost immediately, and because it's going to be a long process. All right, so you're basically budgeting for two years of runway as sort of a baseline.
Absolutely, and I think that what we'd also very much like to see in our teams is start building and engaging with an audience.
Much sooner.
Yeah, just very soon, because I think that game developers tend to want things to be perfect before they show something. But the importance of actually engaging with people who are interested in your game and want to be a part of the journey, just as you think about it. I mean, everyone is self-publishing until they get a publisher, and for most of our teams, we want them to self-publish. And so the building and engaging with that audience is just incredibly important.
Well, and this sort of comes to something that I've been talking about, the concept of inception publishing, right? Is basically to start the self-publishing process to demonstrate that your game is publishable in order so the publishers believe that the game is publishable. But to Lina's point, the idea is just assume publishers don't exist. And just start that process of building an audience, announcing your game, collecting wish list, doing all that stuff. And the irony is, if you actually ignore all the people with money and you just focus on the game and building your audience, at one point they're going to come knocking on your door and say, "Oh, I noticed this big community and fan base that you're building up." And it's happened literally in the past 2 weeks with two of the studios that I work with. They put their demo up. They were minding their own business. They weren't doing any pitches, nothing. And the demo ended up on the Steam trending and was getting tons of positive reviews. And out of nowhere in their inbox, they were getting publishers were pitching them. And then in another case, actually with Tencent, one of the games had a huge launch announcement, had hundreds of thousands of wish lists, and all of a sudden the Tencent guys come knocking and say,
But I'd say the role of a publisher is changing. Because again, back in the day, the platforms were a closed shop. There was no ID at Xbox or other programs. You had to sign up with a publisher to write off their PLA to get your game to market,
but it was a gatekeeper.
Then to get a disc made or a cartridge. Now, and back then it was retail relationships mattered and all the rest of it. Now I think publishers, see the rise of these more boutique publishers, and I think it's very, very different. To me, a lot of indies, I guess Rami probably comment, but you're looking more for ones who have the access to the right,
audience,
influencers, community managers, etc., that care about what a publisher used to do in the past. So I think the role of a publisher is just, AAA, maybe it's the same, but for the indies, it's fundamentally changed.
Well, and he's queuing you up, Rami, but also, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are often dealing with sort of smaller indies, and indies also coming from more exotic sort of developing regions, maybe a little bit different profile than, let's say, the studios that Lina and Behold are looking to invest in up here in the north. So what's that perspective?
Actually, I think it's very much in line. I think that the role of publisher is changing, where before the sort of common idea is the publisher is effectively taking the risk, right? The developer is creating this idea that the publisher can take risk on, and the publisher is taking the risk. That's faded out entirely. Publishers are not taking risk anymore. Very often, publishers don't want to really get involved unless you have something really special. They don't want to get involved unless there's some sort of market validation, there's some sort of virality, there's some sort of progression, or there's existing revenue, some sort of proof. I still recommend indies to pitch first, and I know that this is a disagreement between us, but I still recommend indies to pitch first and to just pitch to everybody and just to get a feeling. But it's also because you can effectively use the publishers as feedback machines for your game. You can get an idea of what the market fit is. If you get 150 publishers all going yes, we'll sign it, then you probably don't need a publisher, right? So I still recommend you start by pitching, you have those conversations, and if nobody bites, go public, right? Start talking, get loud, talk about your game. The risk matrix is great, because if everybody in the publishing world, every investor said no, and you go live, and it goes viral, like you said, they'll come back. So I still recommend just like do that. But the thing I really need indies to stop doing is to build 2 separate video games. Because what they do is they start by building a version of the game that's purely for pitching. And they're progressing far past where they should be going. Instead of doing proper pre-production, they're going straight to like, okay, we're going vertical slice, we're getting on. Their systems aren't done, they haven't play tested properly. They're just getting straight to like, how do we get money as quickly as possible? Then they get money, now they have to tear the whole thing back down and build a new one. So that's the shift that's happening, is very much publishers are no longer at the start of the risk taking. That's you as the developer, and that means that the scope of things is also shifting.
Okay, there's a production shift that's occurring related to that, but I'm going to ask about that, but just super quick. When you say go out and do a round of pitching, I mean, I think the trap is that developers will do that, at GDC. No one says no, but no one says yes. And they had a bunch of good vibe meetings. Okay, now let's work on that build, and we'll go see everyone again at Nordic.
So I call that
that stalling process. That I think is paralyzing.
No, but the reason that happens, I think, if you think it's a funnel, the top of the funnel. If you're a biz dev guy who's signing games, you want to keep the plate spinning. Yep. You don't want to say no. You want to keep your options open. And what's happening, the bottom of the funnel, they may used to have signed 5 games a year. Now they sign 1 game a year or none. Yeah. But they're still their job is to keep talking, keep everybody interested. So I had a meeting with someone this morning where they said the most helpful thing an investor or a publisher can do is say no. Yeah. Not leave them hanging and not knowing, because then they go away and rebuild or whatever and think there's still a hope.
Or worse, and this is a pet peeve of mine, is very often publishers that want to say no, they'll try to say no politely. And when they say no politely, they'll try to find a reason. But very often that reason has nothing to do practically with it. I had a developer come to me a few months ago that said, yeah, the publisher loved the game, but they said no because they don't really think a monkey as a main character will sell right now. So we're going to redo the main character. I'm like, no, don't redo it, because you redo the main character, they're still going to say no. Yeah. It's not the monkey. If it was the monkey, they would invest in the game and say, hey, we should talk about changing the monkey.
Yeah. So. But just to clarify, though, I think your advice is go out, pitch everyone. Kind of get that data. Yep. I mean, if someone on the spot says, "Here's the $1 million," okay, great. Fine, you've got a deal. Yep. But if you don't get that sort of immediate interest, then get back to work. Don't go from show to show and just kind of get punted and get the wishy-washy.
3-ish months until a real conversation is happening, and there's if you're having a real chat and it feels like they're actually making a move, maybe there's a short term or like a short form contract, or you're sitting down with somebody else than the biz dev, the scout. Because the scout will, you always want to keep your plate spinning.
So you're pegging that at about 3 months, and if after 3 months it's not a deal, then get
1 or 2 shows.
Yeah, well, so fine. I think that's take a shot. Yeah. I think the danger is if developers are like, oh, well, what's 1 more month? What's another show? And then what ends up happening is a bit to Rami's point earlier, is you sort of get so diverted with the process of pitching and updating the pitchable build and all this kind of, that you're not doing any marketing, you're not doing any community building, you're not doing any audience validation, and the most likely outcome will you get punted to the next show, and then it's like a year later, and it's like, oh, we were so close on so many, and then really, nothing happened. So fine. Yeah. Right. Do a round of pitches, but have the discipline to kind of okay, it's not happening.
I think Lina just said it really well. I think you're self-publishing until you're not, right? Until there's a signature, you should always assume you're self-publishing.
So another thing that I think is happening, you're talking about the build for publishers. I think the other one is this pressure to self-publish and get stuff out early means that the production process essentially has changed. That speed to 30 seconds of gameplay video, speed to a playable build in order to run play tests, and sort of visual first development. Right, oftentimes, the big triple, you always do the visual pass at the end, whereas now there's so much pressure to get out a sexy 30 seconds of gameplay and build your Steam page with some nice screenshots that you're totally front-loading all of the visual design, before all the systems are there and so on. I mean, do you kind of agree with that? Like that's what's happening, and that's what an issue, or
that's what I'm saying. I'd actually love to know how that feels on your side of the fence.
Does it seem shallow, or does it seem like that's the necessary?
I mean, I'd say back in the day, when you went to early access was basically a beta. You're genuinely putting it out there because the game wasn't ready to be testing. Now, I mean, most people like me will say early access is effectively their launch. Yeah, it may be PC only and not console, and yes, it may not be fully featured, but they're generating in most cases money at that point. So early access and game preview and these other things are kind of an anomaly. It's just shifted the release forward, and it's not what it originally started out as being a way to get player feedback.
Yeah, but anyways, I'm just sort of throwing it out there because you talked about the sort of diversion to the publisher build. I also think, although I always recommend, and Lina as well, to go out early, get that audience validation, I do think it is inherently changing the way we are sort of scheduling our productions. But is that good or bad? I don't know.
I'm not sure though. I mean, I think about it, before I was doing what I'm doing right now, I was a producer at various studios, and there's always that, even if it's not outward facing, there's always that executive presentation or something that's happening internally at the large companies. So you kind of always feel like there is, you need to be doing a visual pass, or you need to be kind of polishing up a corner, or perhaps there's some smoke and mirrors because you need to show something. So I'm not sure that even kind of having something public facing earlier changes things a lot.
Yeah, fair point.
I think before I would often hear about the concept of a beautiful corner, right? Like you make a beautiful corner, you make one space, and you do a space that's sort of vertical slicey, but then you do one part that's really vertical slicey, and that still exists. Although I hear a lot more like a beautiful level now, whereas because if a player is going to be walking through it, the scope gets much larger for these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really starts with the 30 seconds of gameplay. Yeah. Because then that makes the trailer that then goes on the Steam page that then allows you to announce the game, and so. But you have to have the beautiful level to produce the beautiful 30 seconds, etc. But Mark, putting kind of Tencent on the spot here. I mean, obviously, you have almost infinite capacity to buy up studios. You also do minority investment in studios. I mean, I thought that as studios were crashing over the past year or two, that a lot of the big strategics were just going to gobble everything up. Why didn't you do that?
Well, we've still got to be sensible.
Either as a kind of like a mercenary move, we're just going to grab all the good stuff, or kind of almost a savior.
Fundamentally, I think at Tencent, I mean, the thing I've seen since I joined is it is a company of gamers. We really look at people who are making great creative stuff. And people often say to me, well, what does Tencent look for? And if you look across the investments, some are public, some are not public. But, we've invested in console, PC, mobile, free-to-play, premium, different genres. But if I think there's a common thread, it's creators who can make great IP. The hardest thing in this industry, I believe, is to do the 0 to 1. Tencent is quite good at helping maximize the potential with, if you think of what we've done with Call of Duty Mobile, PUBG Mobile.
So that's like the 1 to the 100.
Yeah, 1 to 100. But the 0 to 1 is the part that needs the real. I think that's why Europe is still the most exciting place in the industry. I mean, America in the past has been the home of AAA. You could say Asia's been mobile, but Europe is, I don't know, maybe the home of the creativity in the indie scene. I mean, back in the day, when there was the Spectrum, Amiga, I know we're here in the Nordics, which is home of the sort of demo scene. Why there's so many great developers now. I mean, it's still incredible to me why you look in the Nordics, how many great developers are here versus, no offense if there's people from Spain or Italy, but you don't get that same number. And I guess it's as simple as if you're in those countries as a kid, you're probably on the beach as a kid. And here, maybe the weather's not so good, you're inside coding. And, but I think really the Nordics is really the home of some of the best, gaming studios because of that history going back to the 80s.
I think it's a combination of many things, but I think one of the things that's very easy to forget if you're in Europe is how well our safety nets function.
Yeah, true.
So even if I don't have investment, and that's maybe more true towards the north of Europe than it is in the south of Europe, but in the Netherlands, I started an indie game studio straight out of university. I dropped out, no money, nothing, and I was not worried about money at all. Right, like at no point in my life did I go like, "Oh, this is going to cost me my life," or "I'm going to go to the hospital and I'm not going to be able to afford it." Like I could just do this thing, and I had a little job selling computers on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at MediaMarkt. And that's how I funded the first year and a half of Lambeer. Was like I was also selling computers on the weekend, and that is a very unique quality to Europe that I think is. That we often forget about, that it gives us a tremendous ability to experiment, to try new things, to set up small studios, to get to that first revenue, and to start growing from there. And I think too often in Europe we try to replicate the American model, which is like we do or die, right? Like everything has to go on this. It has to be $1 million game. It has to be a $5 million game. No, we can do a $160K game and probably do that off of European funding and some local funding.
And I think I think that's a great point. And I think it creates different studios and different cultures and different games come out of different regions for these reasons. Because I think that, having worked in both Europe and North America, I think the culture and the vibe is very, very different. And I think that those social safety networks are definitely a big reason for that, because you can, live off noodles and unemployment and make games here and if you lose your job, well, the net catches you.
Well, this makes me think of the role of government and some of the grants and public funding schemes or tax incentives and so on that exist around the world. I mean, I think famously in Sweden there has been no government intervention, whereas if you look at like Finland, they had the famous Tekes Skine program back in 2012 or so that infused 30 million euros, and you have even in Denmark there's the new NIMBY fund that's providing some amount of funding, and you can kind of go around Europe, around the world, and some places there's nothing, other places there's lots of stuff. I mean, I know, Rami, you've kind of been around the world like myself, where you've seen some of that stuff in action. Do you really see that as other than the sort of the normal social safety net that's not game specific, do you see government intervention supporting games and startups as a kind of a net positive? Do you think that's really a good thing, or you see it as...
There's sort of like a spectrum. There's like when there's none, it's bad. When there's too much, it's bad, right? If there's too much, you end up with these studios that just sort of like go around this loop of like fund to fund to fund. But what you see is when governments strategically point at ideation, like new studios, new crews, they have a strategy for a scale up. How do I get from 10, 20, 30 people to 100? And they have that space in between to sort of like grow your studio in your first two, 3 steps into the industry. That very targeted, very smartly positioned money at any scope is helpful. I do think that there are examples of governments that went a little too easy on it, or didn't have the right people or the right expertise in place to properly support that. And then you get stuck in this cycle of studios that aren't becoming sustainable on their own. So overall, net positive. I think absolutely money into the industry, an incredible opportunity. Digital economy is an incredible opportunity in every government, in every place. Like, you make it wherever, especially in places across the world. You look at Indonesia or Uruguay or any of these places where the economy is much weaker. With very small, very simple targeted funding, these studios are making money on US markets in US dollars, where a small hit can fund a studio.
So, Lina, if you were in front of Swedish Parliament making a request or proposal to help the game industry, what would you recommend?
No, I think just looking at Behold Ventures, we are the first video game fund to get funding from the European Investment Fund. So pan-European funding specifically aimed at getting money into kind of small and mid-size early-stage companies in the industry. So I think it's happening on a local level, but it's also happening across Europe through the European Investment Fund. But I think, it's interesting, Sweden doesn't seem to have needed it to build, one of the most thriving video game industries in any nation. But Finland also, kind of having a great ecosystem, also has, has ample support. So I think that's really, really interesting. But I think that I'm sure that the Swedish dataspelsbranschen would really like for the Swedish Parliament to support it. And I think that particularly for these, in the current times, getting funding into early stage companies, I mean, we get a lot of pitches from Sweden. And I mean, we are, probably we invest in about 0.001% of what comes across our desks. So I'm sure, and we definitely feel like there's lots of interesting cases out there that don't necessarily fit for venture funding, but are games that should be made by studios that could create good games and generate good revenue.
Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but I'd say Canada to me was the example of the government that seemed to most encourage development. And I know sort of in UK and others, everyone always talks about we need investment schemes like Canada had. So we should turn the thing and ask you how you feel.
Well, I'm very critical of, and in fact, I think they kind of shot themselves in the foot as a sort of national policy, because Canada was very focused on what we call FDI, which is foreign direct investment, which is the fancy government term for attracting foreign companies to set up shop. So famously, Ubisoft coming to Montreal, back in the late 90s, as well as EA and Square Enix and IDOS and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is fine to create jobs at a baseline. But none of those studios own the IP in Canada, because it's owned in Japan, in London, in France, in California. And all the decisions are made outside of the country. And also all of the revenue is recognized outside of the country. So basically these are cost center factories that has factory workers of programmers and artists and designers. And you get a certain degree of economic impact because those people pay rent and buy groceries and so on. But most critically, what you realize after a decade or 2 decades, there are no exits. There are no owners of the Ubisoft factory. There's no owners of the EA factory. They're just well-paid factory managers. They might drive a nice car, they may have a cottage, but they never become angel investors. And so what you see, particularly in the Nordics, Sweden and Finland especially, is the ones that have succeeded turn around and they give back and they reinvest and they help the next generation and they share their wisdom and their funds. And it kind of creates that cushion that really helps propel the industry forward. And so one of the major gaps in Canada, which is a direct result of the economic policy, we have no angels. Because there are no exitable companies. I'm oversimplifying to a certain extent, but like 90% of our workforce work at AAA, a foreign-owned studio. So,
yes, careful what you wish for.
Careful what you wish for.
It's also interesting because a lot of those teams, the people that spin off of them, do not have that business knowledge or do not have that ability to look at the opportunities that are there. And so very often, these people like that come through me to sort of like figure out like, hey, what do we do? It's like, well, you need somebody who is good at this, but that person does not necessarily exist in your vicinity. And we're seeing around the world, I see several governments sort of use that same strategy of like, let's get foreign companies to land in the country. It doesn't work. But you need that full ecosystem. You need the indies at the bottom, like the startups, the small ones. You need investment companies that are looking at these companies sort of like growing. You need the scale ups. And then you need your AAAs or your big companies that are really keeping that floating. So,
well, if there are any government people in the room, don't follow the Canadian example. Come see me and I'll tell you how to do it properly. But all right, we only have like 2-3 minutes left. Quick one-shot bit of advice for developers in the room, how to kind of navigate the next 12 months or so. Lina, I'll put you on the spot first.
Putting me on the spot, but I would say, definitely don't lose hope. I think that's one. I think the industry, people are going to continue to play games. So figure out how to get your game out to your players, build a community, and demonstrate that there is something there that players are interested in.
Yeah, validation. All right, Mark.
I'm going to copy. If people were here earlier, Harry Kruger was on the stage and he was giving advice of make the game you want to make. Make something you have a passion in yourself rather than what you think people want or following market trends.
But find an audience that also wants it, right? All right, Rami.
I can talk about this for an hour, which is literally what I'm going to do after this talk. So if you stick around for 15 minutes.
So your advice is stick around, watch the next
15 minutes. If you want to know what my opinion is on this whole situation, I'm going to do a talk about how to pick the right game and how to survive in this industry. So if you're an indie, you're interested in that, for sure. But I think very much in line with that, like pick things you care about, and then figure out how to make them into a product, a game, a studio. You can't just follow passion. You can't just follow market. You have to find your way through that.
And related, but I'll give it a subtle twist, is all the developers that are running game studios and believe their business is about making games, like, hey, you're in the game-making business, you're all in the wrong business. You have to rethink of your business as a fan-building business. That first and foremost, the goal of the studio is to find your fans, build the community, grab that audience, and then make games for that audience, and so that they fall in love with you and your studio. It's a subtle mindset shift, but that subtle mindset shift will help kind of feed into this kind of process. And the more you have that audience, the more you're able to navigate turbulent times. So all of you should quit being in the game-making business and be in the fan-building business. All right, with that, our panel is done. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you everyone for sticking around. And don't leave, because Rami's going to give you all the clues and hints the next step. So thanks, everyone. Awesome. Very good. Yeah.
Thanks, mate.